He's a PhD student in St. Gallen, currently also visiting NYU, and David Yermak from NYU. And in this paper, we investigate how cartel firms, that is, firms which are involved in illegal price-fixing agreements, attempt to hide these conspiracies, and we mainly focus on signal jamming financial reporting strategies and the avoidance of outside monitoring, for example, by the board of directors and by auditors. And we also have some results on strategies that they may use for preempting future legal enforcement, such as, for example, excessive political spending and job creation. So let's start with a definition of cartels. We borrowed this definition actually from John Connor. He's a law professor at Purdue, probably the most well-known and prolific scholar in this field. We also actually obtained our data set on cartels, as we will see from John Connor. And he defines so-called hardcore cartels as an association of legally independent firms that aims to raise their joint profits through explicit agreements. And of course, important here is explicit. And those agreements usually include price fixing, bid rigging, and some sort of capacity output restrictions, or a combination of those three things. And of course, for a cartel to work and to survive for as long as possible, those cartel firms have, on the one hand, to deter cheating within the cartel. Because of course, as soon as one firm cheats, the cartel usually dissolves and they deviate from their agreement, of course, resulting in the cartel to disappear. They also have to discourage new entries, of course, or if there are new entries, they probably have to try to convince them to join the cartel, of course, at the danger of the cartel being detected. And the third thing that they have to do, and this is where our paper mainly focuses on, is they have to distract regulators, media, analysts, and of course also the customers that pay the bill for those cartel agreements for not being detected. And we're going to look at strategies that they may use for concealing their conspirative behavior. Now let's start with an example. That's one of our sample firms. It's a well-known pharmaceutical company, Bristol Myers Squibb. And this company was charged with, for participating in a total of 3 cartels during our sample period. Those 3 cartels all took place between the time period 1999 and 2004. And the first thing that I'm going to show here is their segment reporting that they did throughout this time period. And we can see here that's where the first cartel started in 1999, that they reported 4 segments, then they omitted any segment reporting for 2 years. They introduced 3 new segments, basically replacing their medicines segment by pharmaceutical segment and introducing 2 new ones and so on. So they changed their segment reporting on a yearly basis nearly. And this, of course, may help, of course, to make it harder to compare financial results year by year and to help them, of course, to conceal what's going on within the different product groups. Looking at one example for the propensity to report misleading financial statements. These are the original earnings that they reported over this time period. They did not only have to restate once or twice, but actually 3 times, 2 times even resulting in being sued for securities fraud during this time period. As another example, looking at the outside monitoring by the board of directors, these are the 8 outside directors they had on the board in 1999. Or actually at the year end of 1998, before the cartel started. 5 of those guys are classified as busy, holding 3 or more board seats. They appointed 3 new directors to their board during the cartel time period, 2 in 1999. One was also busy. The other one was a foreign outside director, actually living in Sweden. They appointed another one in 2005. This one also classified as busy. Now, of course, and we're going to come back to this, there's some research that you probably all know, for example, by Schiff, Dasani, and Fitch on board busyness, or by Ronald Masoulis and Coulters on foreign independent directors, that lets us assume that busy directors and foreign independent directors are associated with weaker monitoring from the board of directors. Now, what happened in 2006 after cartel had been discovered, right before pleading guilty for those charges? They actually appointed a new outside director, which was considered as a law and order outside director, which is Louis Freeh, a former FBI director and federal judge. They replaced the auditor for the first time in 9 or more years. They had the same auditor as we just learned about before during the whole cartel time period. And they also added a new CEO. They appointed a new outside CEO after having had 2 internally promoted CEOs before during the whole cartel time period. And of course, we're going to come back to all those points and a number of others when looking at our larger sample. So let's look at the sample that we use. The cartel information is retrieved from this so-called private international cartel dataset by John Connor. This dataset became, I think about 1 or 2 years ago, became commercially available, so you can buy this data from John Connor. He updates it regularly, the dataset. Our version is an older version somewhat, but it's still extended as compared to the dataset that he uses in his 2010 paper. The dataset includes cartel firms worldwide, excluding protected cartels such as the OPEC, for example, only explicit hardcore cartels as defined before, and only cartels that were sanctioned by the governments within 5 years after discovery. If there's no sanction taking place, the firms are not included in this dataset. There's a total of roughly 650 cartels covered by the dataset, a bit more than 2,000 companies, mostly located in Europe. About 800 of those companies are located in the US. We focus on US firms, and as we focus on public US firms for data availability reasons, our sample is then reduced to 218 public US firms after requiring coverage on CompuStat and after requiring the cartel period to have been ex post determined by authorities to have started after 1986, the start of our cartel period, because for the other firms, you don't know how long the cartel already lasted before our sample period starts. So, of course, to compare our cartel firms and their behavior to other companies, we have to set up a control sample. And we do different approaches to identify a control group. The standard in the current version of the paper is that we, for each cartel firm, we collect all firms on CompuStat in the same 2-digit SIC code, and then we choose the 5 closest one in size as defined by total assets. And the total number of cartel firm year observations that we have on those 218 firms is roughly 1,500. And we only use the cartel firm year observations for cartel firms. So we do not include them before they became part of a cartel agreement, and we don't keep them in the sample as control firms after the cartel has been discovered and they have been charged. And the sample for the control group that we obtained this way is about roughly 12,000 firm year observations on 721 companies. And for those firms, we actually used the whole set of usable firm year observations. And this turns out to be, or to show as a problem in our univariate analysis, which I'm not going to show, as we use the whole history of those control firms. And of course, some of them started as very small companies in CompuStat 30, 40 years ago before the matching, and were much smaller. So currently, the difference in mean size is about a factor of 3. Now, if we drop the history of those firms, which you do in the new version of the paper, there's much closer in size. The control group is much closer in size to the cartel firms. And we're going to lose quite a few observations, as we're going to see in different parts of the analysis. So let's start with our first main result, or our first main table. We have a lot of them, and I'm going to summarize most of them on two slides for time reasons. Now, this one here is our standard setup. It's a pooled regression, usually with time and industry fixed effects. And the variable of main interest is the first one. Let's highlight this one. The cartel firm indicator variable, which is just equal to 1 if this is a cartel firm year, and 0 for the control firms. And in the first 2 columns, the dependent variable here is a dummy for whether the board of directors becomes smaller. And in the second part of the table, it's the percentage of directors that leave the board. And what we can see here is that directors in cartel firms are on the one hand more likely to resign, One interpretation here, of course, is that they may leave quietly to prevent future legal liability, for example, which would be consistent with the paper by Fallenbrock, Lowe, and Stulz for outside directors leaving ahead of trouble, for example. And they're not replaced, apparently, or not replaced as often as in other companies. So the board becomes smaller, significantly smaller than that of control firms during the cartel time period, which, of course, reduces the outside exposure, having new directors potentially providing monitoring, detecting the cartel. Now, once they do appoint new directors, we also analyze their characteristics. We focus on 3 different board characteristics, which all have been shown in recent papers to be associated with weaker monitoring. One is board busyness. Another one is the foreign independent director variable that we obtained from Ronald Masulis. And the other one is a history of bad attendance rates of those directors. We can see here that the newly appointed directors by cartel firms are more likely to be busy, more likely to have low attendance rates, and more likely to be foreign and live in another country. We're also looking at CEO turnover, and what you can see here is that turnover, of course, again, putting the cartel agreement at danger to be detected, and of course then made public by a new CEO who takes over and wants to prevent any future legal liability for himself. So there's a lower incidence of CEO turnover, as we can see here. And if there's a new CEO, the CEO is significantly more likely to be promoted from the inside. We're also looking at changes in the auditor. What's important here is the sample in this table only includes firm years in which the company is with a Big Four auditor, because cartel firms in our sample, as they're very large companies usually, are less than 2% of the observations are associated with a non-Big Four auditor. And the control firms might be more likely to change to a larger auditor, and therefore we only include firm years in which the company is already with a Big Four and changes to another Big Four. And of course, we drop all firm years in which there's a forced change, for example, companies being with Arthur Andersen in 2001. So those are excluded. And what you can see here is cartel firms are less likely to change auditors than control firms. Here's the result on political donations by the Political Action Committee sponsored by our companies. And what you can see here is cartel firms are more likely to donate. They are more likely to donate larger sums. Actually, in the whole political spending database for the US, the 4 largest spendings are made by cartel firms in our sample. And what you can see here is they're also more likely to, or they do spend to more individual candidates, which is this political index from a paper by Jan Cooper and co-authors in the JF 2010. And then finally, we also have some evidence on earnings restatements taking place more often for cartel firms. And to summarize here the remainder of our findings, we also find them to grow stronger than control firms in market cap, in profitability, but somewhat surprisingly also in employment and in investments in property, plant, and equipment. And this, of course, may also work as a preemptive strategy to prevent future legal enforcement, as authorities might be more reluctant to enforce companies that are large employers in the region that do a lot of investment in this region. We also find the cartel firms to be more likely to have CEOs picking their top management team, which is based on the setup of the bottom-up governance by Landy and co-authors. We find them to be more likely to use earnings manipulation via accruals and deferred earnings. We find them to be more likely to reclassify segments, as we saw before, to be more likely to be sued for securities fraud, and also we find the CEOs of those cartel firms to exercise stock options more rapidly than those of the control firms, which is consistent with the findings in Kedia and Philippon in a paper on fraudulent accounting, where managers on the one hand may cash in this excessive valuation that results from the cartel agreement, as we saw in this analysis, which is summarized here on the first part. And of course, they may also signal to the regulators, to the observers, that they do not expect this excessive profitability to continue for infinity. So let's conclude. We do find systematic patterns of specific behavior by cartel firms, mostly related to single-channel financial reporting activities, also to avoid external monitoring, to avoid exposure to new CEOs, to new members of the board that are brought in. So they seem to be reluctant to do that. And we may, of course, also expect those actions going on in other firms, not only with involved in price fixing agreements, but in other types of fraudulent activities. So thank you very much.